What you manifest in your mind, you can bring to reality.
The Amazing Johnathan documentary has hit Hulu, and I am not talking about the documentary I discussed on a previous episode entitled Always Amazing. That is not the same documentary as the Amazing Johnathan documentary, which is out now on Hulu. Both the main subject of the documentary is the Amazing Johnathan, the comedian slash musician, comedian magician, who's has a heart disease and has kind of had problems. So, when this one came out, I figured, well, let's see what this is. I mean, I already watched the other one, which was, a pretty thorough documentary about Jonathan and his career and all these things. So I put this one on, and I'm instantly not happy because this documentary is like right off the bat doesn't seem to be focused on being a documentary about Jonathan, because it kind of glosses over a lot of his past. I mean, just really glosses over it. And goes in. It starts off following him current day, where he's not well, and trying to get back to go perform again. But it also shows him smoking meth, which didn't really. The other one didn't really focus on all of the drugs that he does or did. It was more a documentary about the Amazing Johnathan. Where this one, it seemed like this one had an agenda from the get-go, and at least, like, as this plays out, it makes more sense while it was, but because this documentary ends up becoming a documentary about the making of this documentary. More so, it never really goes into giving a shit about telling the Amazing Johnathan story, because while you're watching this documentary, another documentary crew shows up to do another documentary, and then that one is supposedly tied to the people that produced Man on Wire and some other documentary that was are Looking for Sugarman, which are two like really well-made, well-known documentaries, won Academy Awards. So this other documentary coming in with that clout, Jonathan is like, there's scenes of him telling this documentary, well, why don't you guys wait for that one to come out, and then you release this one, and you ride the momentum of that one. And the whole time I'm wondering, and then there's another documentary that comes out. So I'm spoiling this, by the way. I mean, you could watch it if it's interesting. Don't watch this if you want to know, like, if you want a documentary about the Amazing Johnathan. Like, you're not like, if you want to watch where he came from, what his growth as an artist was, and like the ups and downs of his career, a real in-depth documentary, Always Amazing. It was released free on YouTube by All Things Comedy, directed by Steve Byrne. And if you want to watch an interesting documentary that tangentially involves, I mean, it does not tangentially necessarily, but it's more a documentary about this documentarian, the guy making the documentary, and his troubles doing so. It reminded me a lot of a documentary called The Journey, which is it's super hard to find. I found you can find a website that has it streaming, but it's not one that's wildly available. But it was a documentary about a guy who decided to tour around the world in his van and interview leaders and CEOs questions, advice. This is like pre-Joe Rogan. This is pre-TED Talks, where he's going around and you're getting a lot of interesting advice. It was a documentary that really lent itself to my journey, but that documentary becomes very much about how do you like the problems involved with making the documentary. It becomes very meta, which is very similar to this one. This is a documentary about the making of a documentary about the Amazing Johnathan and the multiple documentaries that have apparently been scheduled and booked to film. So it's interesting. Like, one of the documentaries is just another street performer that thought he would do a documentary. So he's kind of like a small beans one. Then there was one that started like years and years ago with Jonathan, but then ended up not finalizing, not finishing their work. And then the third one, which is the second one in the timeline, I don't know. It's all confusing. Is actually the Always Amazing documentary. Which was interesting watching this and seeing that the big conflict that they were having, this crew that's supposedly from Man on Wire, and which they're not. Steve Byrne is a stand-up comedian. This is the first documentary he's ever done, and it was produced by All Things Comedy, which All Things Comedy recently partnered with Comedy Central. And they showed in that one of the emails where it's like this Comedy Central. It's like, clearly you're using, this is how you sell. It's like, oh, I'm attached in some way to this thing. Let me use this big name that I'm attached to as a selling point to make it more, And plus, Steve Byrne is a friend of Amazing Johnathan. Like, they've worked together. Like, Steve Byrne's early career doing stand-up was touring with Jonathan. I believe that's how they met. But it's like, that one's a very heartfelt documentary, and then this one, it just kind of feels like the director of this one was just, he wanted to do a movie about how he got fucked over, but at no point really cared about doing the documentary on the subject. It was kind of trying to make it like, is Jonathan just making up this whole illness thing? Like, it seemed like that was a storyline that they tried to put in towards the end of this documentary. Like, is this all just a farce? Is this all just, but because I had watched the other one, it's like, I know he's really ill and like, could potentially be dead. So it's like, when they went into it, they didn't go in hard enough. They weren't selling it hard enough to be like, oh, maybe this whole thing is a sham, So it's interesting as a documentary about making a documentary when everything goes wrong. It's interesting on that level, but ultimately, it's a shame that Steve Byrne's documentary isn't called the Amazing Johnathan documentary, and then this one called Always Amazing, because it is amazing that anything really gets created in Hollywood, especially documentaries. But as far as like a documentary that wants to actually show the subject matter, this one doesn't really do it. It's like, this one, you could tell this documentary had a chip on its shoulder from the start, and then once it like has this thing at the end where it's like the maker of this documentary like finds a win in the whole situation, but the win in the situation was like, you find out later that it really doesn't even mean anything. That like, all of the kind of crap that they were talking about, this other documentary crew, was like, it was all just kind of a misunderstanding. I don't know. It was interesting. It's an interesting documentary, but don't expect to actually, which is, if you go see the other one and watch this one, it's just kind of an interesting supplemental kind of a thing to the whole story that takes place in this documentary, because it's like, the other documentary that's going on. But yeah, ultimately, I would not be excited to watch another doc by this guy. Not really. It's interesting, though. It's very interesting. But that's it for this episode. New episodes daily. Subscribe on IGTV, YouTube, and everywhere else podcasts are found. Go buy my original artwork over at InspiredDisorder.com and save 25% when you use coupon code RTS for The Ray Taylor Show. Follow me on social media at Ray Taylor. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Peace out!